They told me I had until winter to produce a son, or I would lose my head. My name is Isabelle de Valois, and I became Queen of France at 19 years old when I married King Louis XII in 1648. I was chosen for my youth, my proven fertile bloodline. Every woman in my family for 4 generations had borne multiple children, and my political insignificance as the daughter of a minor duke. My sole purpose was simple and absolute: give France an heir to secure the Bourbon succession. But after 2 years of marriage, my womb remained empty. Not from any failing of mine, but because of a secret the king guarded more carefully than the crown jewels. Louis was sterile, incapable of fathering children due to a childhood illness that had left him permanently damaged. And in the summer of 1650, with political enemies circling and succession crisis looming, my husband gave me an ultimatum that would change 3 lives forever: produce a son by winter, or face execution for failing in my most sacred duty as queen. But since he could not give me that child himself, he made arrangements. At midnight on August 15th, he locked me in the tower room with the royal executioner, a massive man who stood nearly 7 feet tall and smelled of blood and iron, a man whose hands had taken countless lives and who now was commanded to give life instead. "Conceive tonight," the king whispered through the locked door, "or die tomorrow." This is the story of how a desperate king's impossible command, a terrified queen's will to survive, and an executioner's unexpected humanity created the most scandalous royal birth in French history, and how the son born from that dark night would eventually discover the truth about his origins and force France to confront the lies upon which its throne was built. Let me take you back to 1648, to the day I arrived at the Palace of Versailles, as a bride who understood nothing about the man I was marrying or the impossible situation I was entering. The de Valois family held a small duchy in Normandy, prosperous enough to be respectable, but not powerful enough to refuse when the king's ministers came seeking a bride for the 38-year-old monarch. Louis had been married once before to a Spanish princess who had died childless after 3 years, officially from fever, though rumors suggested she'd been quietly disposed of when she failed to produce heirs. I was selected as the replacement bride, 19 years old, healthy, from a family known for fertility. My mother had borne 9 children, my grandmother 12, my great-grandmother 10. Surely I would provide France with the sons it needed. The wedding was magnificent, held at Notre Dame with all the ceremony France could muster. I wore white silk embroidered with gold thread, a dress so elaborate it required 3 women to help me dress. Louis was handsome in his formal robes, tall and well-built, with the dark hair and sharp features of the Bourbon line. He smiled at me during the ceremony, and I thought perhaps this arranged marriage might become tolerable, maybe even pleasant. The wedding night shattered any such illusions. Louis came to my chambers as tradition required, dismissed the witnesses who had observed us getting into the bed, and then sat on the edge of the mattress with his back to me. "Isabelle," he said without turning around, "there is something you must understand before we proceed any further." I was terrified, innocent, with only the vaguest knowledge of what marriage entailed. "What must I understand, Your Majesty?" "I cannot give you children. I am sterile, damaged by an illness when I was 12 years old that left me permanently incapable of fathering offspring. The physicians have confirmed this repeatedly. My first wife knew. You deserve to know as well." I stared at his back, trying to comprehend. "But then why marry me? Why marry anyone if you cannot produce heirs?" "Because a king must be married. Because the appearance of attempting to secure succession is politically necessary. Because having a young, fertile queen suggests the possibility of children even if the reality is otherwise. In my first wife's death, she truly died of fever." Louis was silent for a long moment. "She died because she spoke too freely about my condition. Because she threatened to tell the court, to expose the truth that would have destroyed my legitimacy as king. I had her poisoned, Isabelle, and I tell you this so you understand the stakes. Keep my secret, play your role as queen and you'll live in comfort and safety. Betray me and you'll die quietly like she did." Terror turned my blood to ice. "I understand, Your Majesty." "Good." He stood and walked toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. You seem like a kind girl, and you deserve better than this farce of a marriage. But we are who we are, and we do what we must to survive." He left me alone in the marriage bed, and I lay there in the darkness trying to comprehend my new reality. I was Queen of France, married to a sterile king who'd murdered his first wife for threatening to expose him, trapped in a role that demanded children I could never produce through legitimate means. The first year of marriage, I played my part perfectly. Louis and I maintained the fiction of a normal royal marriage. He would visit my chambers regularly, stay for an appropriate length of time, and leave. The court assumed we were attempting to conceive. When no pregnancy occurred after 12 months, whispers began. Perhaps the new queen was barren despite her family history. Perhaps God was punishing France for some unknown sin. Perhaps the king should consider setting her aside, as he had, in their minds, simply lost his first wife to natural causes. By the second year, 1650, the pressure became unbearable. France was surrounded by enemies. Spain and Austria were forming alliances threatening invasion. The English Parliament, fresh from executing their own king, was making aggressive noises about supporting French rebels. And within France itself, noble factions were positioning themselves for the succession crisis they sensed coming. Louis's cousin, Philippe, began gathering supporters, suggesting that if the king remained childless, he, as nearest male relative, should be named heir. Other nobles saw opportunity in chaos and started making their own preparations for civil war. The king's chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, came to me in March of 1650 with a proposition I knew meant death if I refused. "Your Majesty," he began, sitting across from me in my private chambers, "the situation has become critical. The king's inability to produce an heir is destabilizing the realm. We need a solution." "I know what the problem is," I said quietly. "The king told me on our wedding night. Then you understand why we must take extraordinary measures. The succession cannot be secured through normal means, so we must secure it through abnormal ones. You want me to commit adultery, to conceive a child with another man and pass it off as the king's. I want you to save France and your own life simultaneously." His voice was cold, pragmatic. "The king has agreed to this plan. In fact, he demands it. You will conceive a child by whatever means necessary. Present that child as the legitimate heir and secure the succession. The alternative is being quietly executed for barrenness, just as the previous queen was executed for indiscretion." I felt nausea rising. "And if I agree to this monstrous plan, who have you selected to father this child?" "We have several candidates in mind. The choice will be made carefully to ensure the child could plausibly pass as the king's offspring. Someone strong and healthy to maximize the chance of conception. Someone who can be controlled afterward to ensure silence. Someone whose social position makes them unlikely to claim the child later." My hands were shaking. "When do you need my answer?" "You've already given it by not refusing outright." The cardinal stood. "Arrangements will be made. You'll be informed when everything is prepared. Until then, continue playing your role as queen. And remember, Isabel, your life depends on success in this matter." He left, and I sat alone with the terrible knowledge that I was about to be forced into the same situation that had probably led to the previous queen's murder, except I had no choice but to comply. Over the next 4 months, my fear grew into terror as I waited for the cardinal's arrangements. I tried to imagine what they would do, who they would choose, how this horrible plan would be executed. I considered fleeing, escaping France entirely and seeking refuge somewhere, but I knew they would hunt me down and kill me as a traitor. I considered suicide, ending things on my own terms rather than living through whatever nightmare they were planning, but I lacked the courage, so I waited and prayed and tried to prepare myself for the unimaginable. In August, the king summoned me to his private audience chamber. The cardinal was there, along with someone else I didn't recognize, a massive figure standing in the shadows near the door. "Isabel," Louis began, "we've finalized the arrangements. You will conceive a child before winter arrives, or you will be executed for failing in your duty as queen. Given that I cannot father children myself, I'm providing you with an alternative." He gestured to the figure in the shadows. "Step forward, Guillaume." The man moved into the light, and I actually gasped. He was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, with shoulders like a bull and arms thick with muscle. He wore the dark clothing of the executioner's office, and even from across the room I could smell blood and iron on him. His face was hard and weathered, with a thick black beard and eyes that held something I couldn't identify. Fear? Resignation? Anger? "This is Guillaume Marchand," the king continued. He served as royal executioner for 5 years, taking the position from his father who held it for 30 years before him. He's healthy, strong, and bound to absolute secrecy by his position. Any word he speaks of what happens tonight means his immediate death. Tonight? My voice was barely a whisper. Yes, tonight. We cannot delay any longer. The political situation is critical, and you need time to conceive and carry a child to term before Philippe's faction makes their move. So tonight you will be taken to a private chamber in the tower. Guillaume will be brought there as well. The door will be locked from the outside, and you will do whatever is necessary to conceive a child. The cardinal spoke up. To be absolutely clear, Your Majesty, this is not a request or a suggestion. This is a royal command backed by the authority of your marriage vows and your duty to France. Conceive tonight with Guillaume, or face execution tomorrow for treason against the crown and failing to secure succession. I looked at the executioner, this massive man who killed people for a living, whose hands had severed heads and broken bones and ended lives. They wanted me to conceive a child with him, to allow those blood-stained hands to touch me, to create an heir from violence and coercion. Please, I whispered, please don't make me do this. The king's face was stone. You have no choice, Isabelle. Neither does Guillaume. We're all trapped by duty and necessity. Tonight you'll fulfill yours, or tomorrow you'll die. The choice is simply whether you cooperate or force us to make this even more unpleasant than it already is. They took me to the tower room at midnight. It was a small circular chamber high in the oldest part of the palace, furnished with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace burning against the August night chill. The cardinal himself escorted me, gripping my arm as I stumbled up the narrow spiral stairs. Guillaume was already there when we arrived, standing near the window, his massive frame making the room feel tiny. He didn't look at me as the cardinal pushed me inside. You both understand your duty, the cardinal said from the doorway. Guillaume, you will ensure conception occurs tonight by whatever means necessary. Isabelle, you will cooperate fully. I'll return at dawn. If the task is completed satisfactorily, you'll both be released to continue your lives with appropriate rewards and threats to ensure silence. If not, well, Guillaume knows how to operate the executioner's blade. He can demonstrate on the queen if needed. The door slammed shut. I heard a bolt slide into place from outside, locking us in together. Guillaume and I stood in that tower room, 2 people trapped by a mad king's commands, and the silence was suffocating. I pressed myself against the far wall, as far from him as possible, my whole body shaking with terror. He remained by the window, not moving, barely even breathing. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. Outside, the palace was silent, everyone asleep or pretending to be, while this atrocity occurred in the tower. Finally, Guillaume spoke, his voice surprisingly soft for such a massive man, though rough from years of shouting execution announcements. Your Majesty, I don't know what to say, neither do I. My voice trembled. I want you to know I would never have chosen this. Never wanted this. I'm an executioner. I kill people as my profession. I'm not meant for— None of us chose this, I said, hearing my voice break. The king commands and we obey, or we die. But I need you to understand something, Guillaume. I'm terrified of you, of this situation, of what's being demanded. I've been married 2 years and I'm still a virgin because the king cannot. I gestured helplessly. And now I'm expected to, with you, and you're so large and you smell of death and I don't even know you. Guillaume flinched like I'd struck him. I know what I am, Your Majesty. I know how I look, how I smell, what I represent. People have been afraid of me my entire life. My father was executioner before me, and I was raised to take his place. I've never known anything except being the man people fear, the man who brings death, and now they want me to bring life instead, and I don't know how to do that. He turned to face me fully, and in the firelight I could see his face more clearly. It was hard and scarred, yes, but his eyes held unexpected sadness. Your Majesty, I swear to you on my soul, I will not hurt you. I may be an executioner, but I'm not a rapist. I've killed many people, but always as duty required, never from cruelty. I won't add rape to my sins even under royal command. Then what do we do? I asked desperately. Because they expect. They'll know if nothing happens. The cardinal made it clear what happens to both of us if we fail. I know. He ran his enormous hand through his dark hair. I've been trying to figure that out since they first told me about this 3 days ago. Trying to understand how to do what's commanded while causing you the least harm possible. Because you're right, Your Majesty, this is monstrous. Using people like tools, forcing conception as if we're breeding horses. It's wrong, and I hate it, but I don't know how to refuse without condemning us both. Sit down, I said suddenly. You're too tall. It's terrifying to have you towering over me like that. He sat carefully on one of the chairs, which creaked alarmingly under his weight, but held. Even sitting, he was taller than most standing men, but it helped slightly. I remained against the wall, unable to make myself move closer. Tell me about yourself, I said, desperate to think about anything except why we were here. What? Your name is Guillaume Marchand. You're the royal executioner. But who are you beyond that? Why does it matter? Because if I have to do this, I need to see you as a person rather than just the man who might kill me tomorrow if we fail. He was quiet for a moment, then began speaking slowly. I'm 32 years old. I've been executioner for 5 years, since my father died and the position passed to me. I live in a small house near the palace, alone because no woman will marry an executioner. I read when I can, though my education is limited. I go to Mass every Sunday and pray for the souls of the people I've executed. And I hate my job, Your Majesty. I hate it desperately, but it's the only life I've ever known. You hate killing people. I kill people, he corrected quietly. But I don't hate them. I hate that society requires someone to perform these executions, and that person is me. Every time I raise the axe or tighten the noose, I pray that I'm doing God's will, but I'm never certain. The weight of all those deaths is crushing and there's no escape from it. Then why not quit? Leave the position? And do what? I'm the executioner's son. I bear the mark of that in everything I am. No one would hire me. No guild would accept me. I'd starve and probably be executed myself for abandoning a crown appointment. So I continue, and I carry the weight, and I try to do my duty as mercifully as possible. He looked at me directly. Now they've given me a different duty, not to kill but to create life, and I find it just as impossible to contemplate, just as morally complicated, because it requires violating you against your will, even if you technically consent under threat of death. I don't know how to do that and remain human. We sat in silence, the fire casting shifting shadows on the stone walls. I studied Guillaume's face, seeing past the executioner's harsh exterior to the man beneath. Someone thoughtful and burdened, someone who questioned his role rather than simply accepting it, someone who seemed as trapped as I was. You said you read, I ventured. What do you read? Whatever I can find, Your Majesty. Religious texts mostly, some philosophy. My father taught me letters. Said an executioner needed to be able to read death warrants to ensure he was killing the right person. But I found I enjoyed reading beyond just the practical necessity. Have you read Augustine? His Confessions? Yes, Your Majesty. I found a copy years ago. His struggle with sin and redemption resonated with me. Someone whose entire profession is taking life while trying to save his own soul. What did you think of his view that evil is absence of good rather than a force itself? That evil acts come from turning away from God rather than embracing some opposite power. Guillaume's eyes widened slightly. You've read Augustine. I'm Queen of France, I said with a slight bitter smile. I have access to the royal library and very little else to occupy my time in a marriage where I'm decorative rather than functional. So yes, I've read Augustine, and Aquinas, and Boethius. Philosophy is my escape from a life that feels increasingly like a prison. He leaned forward slightly. To answer your question, I think Augustine is partially right. Many evil acts do come from turning away from God, from choosing lesser goods over greater ones. But I also think there's active evil in the world, evil that doesn't just happen from absence but from intention. When men torture prisoners before execution, when they take pleasure in causing pain, that's not just absence of good, that's presence of something dark. The thoughtfulness in his answer startled me. Here was the royal executioner discussing theological philosophy with genuine insight, challenging Augustine's conclusions with careful reasoning. The disconnect between his profession and his mind was profound. Have you ever, I hesitated, then pushed forward. Have you ever taken pleasure in your work? Never. His answer was immediate and vehement. Every execution makes me ill. Every death weighs on me. I do my job as cleanly and quickly as possible to minimize suffering, but I've never enjoyed it. The day I start enjoying it is the day I'll know I've lost my soul completely. That's why this situation is almost worse, because at least with executions I can tell myself I'm fulfilling justice, serving the social order. But this, forcing you to conceive under threat of death, there's no justice in this, just raw exercise of power and desperation. 2 hours passed in conversation. We talked about philosophy, about religion, about the impossible moral position we both occupied. Guillaume told me about growing up as the executioner's son, how children had thrown stones at him, how he'd been educated privately because no school would accept him, how he'd tried once to run away at 16, but had been caught and beaten for shirking his hereditary duty. I told him about my own childhood as a minor nobleman's daughter, raised to be decorative and obedient, married off to secure political alliances, trapped in a role that demanded children I couldn't legitimately produce. We were both prisoners of the positions we'd been born into, and in that shared imprisonment we found unexpected understanding. Finally, as the night wore on and we both knew dawn was approaching, Guillaume said quietly, "Your Majesty, Isabelle, if I may use your name, we need to address what we've been avoiding. The reason we're actually here." I know. My heart began racing again despite the hours of conversation that had made him seem less terrifying, but I don't know how to proceed. Neither do I. He admitted, I'm 32 and I've never been with a woman. No one would have me because of what I am. So I'm as inexperienced as you are and just as frightened, though for different reasons. You're afraid of hurting me, terrified of it. My size, my strength, the violence that's been my whole life. I'm afraid I'll damage you, physically or emotionally, even if I try to be gentle, and I'm afraid of failing, of us both dying tomorrow because I couldn't do what was commanded. I stood slowly, my legs shaking. Guillaume, I've decided something. The king gave me one final ultimatum, a son by winter or your head, but he was sterile. At midnight, he locked me in with you, a giant man smelling of blood and iron. Conceive tonight, the king whispered through that door, or die tomorrow. Those are our choices. Die tomorrow, or live through tonight and hope we've created life from this nightmare. I'd rather live, even if living means doing something I never wanted. Even if it means conceiving a child with the man who might have to execute me if we fail. He stood as well, towering over me again, but somehow less frightening than he'd been hours ago. I'll be as gentle as I know how to be. I'll stop if you ask me to, even knowing it might mean our deaths. Your comfort matters more than their commands. I don't think you can promise me comfort in this situation, but I appreciate the intent. I moved closer to him, forcing myself to be brave. Let's do what we must, Guillaume. Let's create life and hope God forgives us for doing it under coercion. What happened next? I won't describe in detail, except to say that Guillaume kept his promise. He was extraordinarily careful, constantly asking if I was in pain, if I wanted to stop, trying to make a fundamentally terrible situation as bearable as possible given the circumstances. His size made everything difficult and frightening, but his gentleness was undeniable. When it was over, I lay on the bed and cried, not from physical pain, though there had been some, but from the overwhelming complexity of emotions. Shame at the adultery even though it was commanded. Fear that I might now be carrying a child. Relief that I'd survived, and something else I couldn't name. A strange tenderness toward Guillaume, who had been forced into this alongside me and had handled it with more humanity than I'd imagined possible. He sat on the floor across the room, giving me space, his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "I'm so sorry, Isabelle. I know those words mean nothing, but I'm sorry for all of it. You did what you had to do to save both our lives," I said quietly. "There's nothing to apologize for. There's everything to apologize for." He looked up, and I saw tears on his scarred face. "I've taken many lives in my role as executioner, but I've never violated anyone. And tonight, under royal command, I did exactly that. It doesn't matter that you technically consented. Consent under threat of death isn't real consent. So I'm sorry, and I'll carry this guilt alongside all the executions, and I'll pray that somehow God forgives me, even though I can't forgive myself." We didn't speak again before dawn. The cardinal returned as promised, examined the physical evidence that we'd fulfilled our duty, and released us with dire warnings. Guillaume, you will speak of this to no one, ever. Isabel, you will present any resulting child as the king's legitimate heir. If either of you breaks silence, both will be executed." Guillaume bowed and left without looking at me. I was escorted back to my chambers where my ladies-in-waiting helped me bathe and dress, assuming I'd simply spent the night in prayer or some other innocent activity. The king summoned me that afternoon to his private study. "Did it happen?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Good. If you're pregnant, we've saved France. If not, we'll repeat the process until we achieve success." The thought of enduring that again made me physically ill. "How many times?" "As many as necessary. The physicians will monitor your cycles. Guillaume will be summoned whenever you're most likely to conceive until pregnancy is confirmed. But surely once would be enough. Sometimes it takes several attempts. We can't take chances, so you'll return to that tower room monthly until we're certain." I left his study and vomited in the corridor. The idea of repeated encounters, of being locked with Guillaume over and over until my body produced the required air, was almost more than I could bear. But what choice did I have? This was survival, and I would endure whatever was necessary to continue living. The next 6 weeks were torment. I waited for my monthly courses to appear, half hoping they would come and prove I wasn't pregnant, half praying they wouldn't because that meant avoiding another night in the tower. I watched for Guillaume around the palace, occasionally seeing his massive figure in the distance when an execution was scheduled. We never acknowledged each other. The silence was necessary and excruciating. In late September, my courses failed to appear. The physicians examined me, performed their tests, and delivered the news I'd been simultaneously hoping for and dreading. "Your Majesty, you are with child." The news spread through court like wildfire. The Queen was pregnant at last. France would have an heir. The king appeared overjoyed, embracing me publicly, praising God for blessing our marriage. Nobles who'd been positioning for succession crisis suddenly proclaimed their loyalty. Philippe's faction collapsed overnight. Political stability returned to France as if by magic, all because of a child conceived through forced adultery in a tower room at midnight. Only 4 people knew the truth: the king, Cardinal Mazarin, Guillaume, and me. We maintained absolute silence, each for our own reasons. The king to preserve his crown, the cardinal to preserve stability, Guillaume to preserve his life, and me to preserve my sanity and my child's future. I carried the baby through autumn and into winter. The pregnancy was healthy and uncomplicated, monitored constantly by physicians who reported every detail to the king. Louis played his role of expectant father perfectly, solicitous and protective, everything a king should be. In private, we rarely spoke about the child's true parentage. We both knew, but acknowledging it openly seemed dangerous even between us. I thought about Guillaume constantly, wondered if he thought about the child he'd fathered, wondered if he felt any connection to the life we'd created, wondered if he regretted that night, or if, like me, he'd found unexpected connection in the midst of horror. I had no way to contact him, no way to tell him I was pregnant with his child. We existed in separate worlds that had intersected for one terrible night, and now could never touch again. On February 3rd, 1651, I went into labor. The birth was long and difficult, nearly 20 hours of agony before the child finally emerged. A son, healthy and strong, weighing nearly 11 pounds, the physicians cleaned him and placed him in my arms, and I looked down at my baby for the first time. He was beautiful, perfect, and he looked nothing like the king. The child had Guillaume's dark hair and broad features, none of Louis's sharp Bourbon characteristics. Most tellingly, he had large hands even as a newborn, hands that would clearly grow to match his father's enormous ones. Anyone looking closely would see the executioner in this child's face, but no one looked closely. They saw what they wanted to see, needed to see. The king's heir, born at last, with his mother's coloring perhaps, but undeniably royal. Louis came to the birthing chamber an hour after delivery. He looked down at the baby in my arms, and I saw recognition flash in his eyes. He knew. He saw Guillaume's features reflected in the child's face. But he smiled and lifted the baby carefully, holding him with surprising tenderness. "My son," he said loudly for the physicians and attendants. "My heir, Prince Antoine, named for my father. May he live long and rule France well." In that moment, Louis claimed the child completely. Whatever he saw in Antoine's face, whatever doubts he harbored, he buried beneath necessity and royal authority. This baby was legally his son, the heir France needed, and that legal fiction would become unquestioned reality through royal decree and willful blindness. The christening occurred 3 days later in Notre Dame. Prince Antoine was baptized before the assembled court, proclaimed heir to the throne, celebrated throughout France. The succession crisis was over. Philippe's faction had no grounds to challenge a legitimate prince. France was stable. Guillaume attended the christening, standing at the very back of the cathedral among the palace servants and functionaries. I saw him watching as the archbishop blessed his biological son, saw the pain and pride in his face. Our eyes met for just a moment across the crowded cathedral, a moment of shared knowledge that this child was ours in blood but could never be acknowledged. Then the moment passed, and Guillaume disappeared into the crowd. I didn't see him again for 3 years. Prince Antoine grew rapidly, a healthy, robust child who exceeded every developmental milestone. By 6 months, he was larger than most year-old babies. By a year, he was walking early and showing remarkable physical strength. By 2, he was talking in complex sentences and displaying surprising gentleness with servants and animals. And always, he looked like his biological father. The dark hair, the broad features, the enormous hands that grew steadily larger. The physical strength that had him wrestling with boys twice his age by the time he was 4. The resemblance was undeniable to anyone who'd seen both Guillaume and Antoine together. But the court maintained its willful blindness. This was the prince, the king's son, and therefore any similarities to the royal executioner were simply coincidence. Louis doted on Antoine with what seemed like genuine affection. He spent hours with the boy, teaching him about governance and strategy, preparing him for eventual rule. If the king saw Guillaume every time he looked at his legal son, he never showed it. He'd committed to this course when he forced me into that tower room, and he would maintain it until death. I raised Antoine with love and anxiety in equal measure. Love because he was mine, the child I'd thought I'd never have. Anxiety because his entire existence was built on coercion and lies have a way of unraveling. I watched him constantly for signs of his father's temperament, and I found them. Guillaume's thoughtfulness, his unexpected gentleness despite his size, his tendency to question rather than simply accept. All of it present in my son. When Antoine was 4 years old, I encountered Guillaume properly for the first time since that night in the tower. I'd been walking in the palace gardens with Antoine playing nearby, attended by his nursemaid, when Guillaume emerged from the executioner's quarters carrying his axe for maintenance. He stopped when he saw us, frozen, staring at the child who was chasing butterflies through the flowers. Antoine noticed the massive man and ran over with a child's fearless curiosity. "You're very big," he announced. "Are you a giant from the stories?" "I'm just the executioner, young prince. I work here at the palace." "What's an executioner?" "Someone who," Guillaume hesitated, clearly unwilling to explain death to a 4-year-old. "Someone who enforces the king's justice." "That sounds important." Antoine studied him with those dark eyes that were identical to Guillaume's own. "You look strong. Can you lift heavy things?" "I can." "Do you like your work?" The question seemed to hit Guillaume like a physical blow. He crouched down to the child's level, bringing his face closer to Antoine's. His voice was gentle. "I do my duty, young prince, even when it's difficult. That's what adults must do. Fulfill their responsibilities even when they wish they didn't have to. My mother says that too. That duty is important even when it's hard." He glanced up at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. "Your mother is very wise." "Antoine," I called. "Come here. Don't bother Master Guillaume. He's working." "It's no bother, Your Majesty." Guillaume stood, his enormous frame casting a shadow over both of us. "He's a fine boy, strong and thoughtful. You've raised him well. He has good parents." I meant me and Louis, but the words came out ambiguous. Guillaume heard the other meaning, the acknowledgement that he was a parent too, even if he could never claim it. "Thank you, Your Majesty." He bowed and left quickly, walking away before emotion could overwhelm him. I watched him go. This man who'd fathered my son in a tower room under threat of death, who'd been gentle when he could have been brutal, who'd been forced into an impossible situation and had somehow maintained his humanity. Antoine tugged on my dress. "Mother, Why does that man look sad? Because he carries heavy burdens, my darling. Sometimes people who seem strong on the outside are sad on the inside. Can we help him? Would you like to? But some sadness can't be helped, only endured. I hoped Antoine would forget the encounter. But children remember more than we realize. Over the next year, he would occasionally mention the sad giant man, asking if I'd seen him, if he was feeling better. I would deflect, change the subject, but I couldn't stop my son's natural curiosity about a man who looked remarkably like him. In 1654, when Antoine was 3 years old, political crisis returned to France. Louis fell seriously ill with what the physicians called a wasting disease, something consuming him from inside. He had perhaps a year to live, possibly less. The reality of his impending death forced us to address questions we'd been avoiding. Who would rule during Antoine's minority? How would we protect the child's legitimacy? What would happen to the people who knew the truth? One evening, Louis summoned me and Cardinal Mazarin to his bedside. He looked terrible, gray and thin, clearly dying. "We need to address the succession," he said without preamble. "Antoine is only 3. He'll need a regent until he comes of age." "That will be the queen," the cardinal said. "Standard practice for a royal minority." "Yes, but there are complications." Louis looked at me directly. "Guillaume Marchand knows the truth about Antoine's parentage. He could theoretically claim the child, challenge the succession, create a crisis. He won't," I said immediately. "Guillaume would never do that. He understands what it would cost Antoine, cost France." "How can you be certain?" "Because I know him. Because he's a man of honor who understands duty and sacrifice. Because he loves." I stopped, realizing what I'd been about to say. The cardinal's eyes narrowed. "The queen seems remarkably confident in the executioner's character. I spoke with him once after Antoine's birth." I lied smoothly. I wanted to ensure his silence. He made it clear he would never endanger the child or the succession. His only concern was that we treat him fairly. "And have we?" Louis asked quietly. "I've provided him with a comfortable income, kept him in his position despite his knowledge. Is that fair treatment for a man who fathered the heir to France?" "It's not enough," I said, "and we all know it. Guillaume was forced into an impossible situation by your command. He did his duty, maintained silence, and will carry the secret until death. The least we can do is ensure his comfort. What do you suggest? Free him from the executioner's position if he wishes, provide him a pension, land somewhere, the option to retire with dignity. Let him have some peace after years of taking lives and knowing his son calls another man father." The cardinal objected. "Freeing the executioner creates questions. Why would we pension him so generously?" "Because he's served loyally for years," I countered. "Because it's a terrible job that takes a toll. Because the king wishes to show mercy as his own life ends. Make it a deathbed gesture of Christian charity." Louis nodded slowly. "Write the orders, Cardinal. Guillaume Marchand is to be offered retirement with a generous pension and land in Brittany if he wishes. Make it clear this is entirely voluntary, that he may keep his position if he prefers, but give him the choice." "Why are you doing this?" Mazarin demanded. "Because Isabelle is right," Louis said. "We used that man cruelly. He gave us the heir we needed, maintained silence when speaking would have been lucrative, and lived with the knowledge that his son would never know him. That deserves better than we've given." Louis died 2 months later in March 1654. France mourned. Antoine, at 3 years old, was crowned King Antoine I, with me serving as regent. The coronation was magnificent despite the child's age, with all the ceremony France could muster. Philippe had died the year before, so there was no succession challenge. The transition was smooth. Antoine sat on his father's throne, too small for the crown they placed on his head, too young to understand that the man he called father had not been his biological parent. Guillaume attended the coronation, standing in his usual place at the back of Notre Dame, watching his son become king. After Louis's death, Guillaume accepted the offered retirement. He moved to Brittany with his pension, bought a small estate, and disappeared from court life entirely. I received occasional reports from my agents that he was living quietly, working wood and metal as hobbies rather than profession, attending mass regularly, seemingly at peace. I was glad. If Guillaume couldn't have his son, at least he could have freedom from the executioner's burden. I ruled as regent for 12 years, guiding France through political challenges and economic reforms. Antoine grew into a capable young man under my tutelage, displaying his biological father's strength and thoughtfulness alongside the political education his legal father had begun. At 15 in 1666, he took full royal authority, and I stepped back into a less formal advisory role. Antoine ruled well. He was strong and just, combining physical power with intellectual depth. He could spend mornings sparring with soldiers, demonstrating fighting skills that amazed his trainers, then spend afternoons debating philosophy with scholars. People called him Antoine the Just, noting his fair treatment of criminals and his reform of execution practices to minimize suffering. He never knew the irony of his compassion toward the condemned, how it echoed his biological father's reluctance to cause unnecessary pain. In 1670, when Antoine was 19, he decided to review the royal court structure and invited me to join him in examining personnel records. We were going through old employment files when he paused on one document. "Mother, who was Guillaume Marchand? Why does he have such an extensive file for an executioner? He was loyal to your father. To both your fathers, if you count his service spanning from Louis's final years into your early reign. Yes, but this shows he was pensioned very generously, given land, retired with unusual honor for someone in that position. Your father, Louis, wanted to show mercy. Sometimes a gesture of Christian charity matters more than strict accounting." Antoine studied the file, then looked at me with those dark eyes that were so like Guillaume's. "Mother, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." My heart began racing. "What do you want to know?" "Guillaume Marchand, the executioner who retired when I was 3. I remember him slightly. A massive man who was kind to me in the gardens once. Why do I look like him?" I felt the world tilt. "What do you mean? Don't lie to me, Mother. I've wondered for years why I don't resemble any portraits of Father Louis, why my hands are enormous when his were delicate, why I have dark hair when the entire Bourbon line is known for auburn, why servants occasionally whisper when they think I can't hear. I thought perhaps I resembled your family, but I've seen portraits of the de Valois line. I don't look like them either." Then I saw this file on Guillaume Marchand, and I thought about the one time I met him, how similar our features were. "How could you possibly remember that? You were 4 years old." "I remember his eyes, Mother. They were exactly like mine, dark and sad and kind. I remember thinking it was like looking in a mirror, except he was old and I was young. And now I'm looking at this file, and I'm asking you directly, is Guillaume Marchand my biological father? I could have lied, should have lied to protect the throne, the succession, everything we'd built. But looking at my son, this young man who'd grown into someone thoughtful and just, someone who deserved truth even when truth was dangerous, I couldn't maintain the lie any longer. "Yes," I said quietly, "Guillaume is your biological father." Antoine was very still. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about Louis' sterility, about the command to conceive with Guillaume, about being locked in the tower room under threat of execution. I told him about Guillaume's unexpected gentleness, his intelligence, his struggle with the moral weight of his role. I told him about the fear and coercion and the strange connection that had formed despite the horror. And I told him about Guillaume's retirement, about Louis's deathbed gesture ensuring the man who'd fathered France's heir could live in peace. When I finished, Antoine sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he said, "Does Guillaume know you've told me?" "No. This is the first time I've spoken the truth aloud to anyone since your father Louis died. And you kept this secret for 19 years. For your protection. If the truth became known, your legitimacy as king would be challenged. You'd face civil war, possible deposition. The legal fiction that Louis was your father has been maintained so carefully that it's become reality in everyone's minds. Breaking that fiction now would destroy you. So I'm king because my biological father was forced to rape my mother under threat of death, and my legal father was sterile and desperate. When you put it that way, it sounds monstrous," I admitted. "But remember, Guillaume and I were both victims of Louis's desperation. We did what we had to do to survive, and from that impossible situation came you, and you've been worth every moment of fear and pain. Does Guillaume want to know me? Want a relationship with his son? He's never said. We've maintained absolute distance since your birth. But I think yes, he'd like to know you. He cried when he saw you as a child. He accepted retirement partially to avoid the pain of watching you grow up calling another man father. What do you want me to do with this information? Antoine asked. Pretend I never learned it. Continue the lie. That's your decision. You're king now, and this is your truth to manage however you think best. I need to meet him, properly, not as a child who didn't understand. I need to talk to Guillaume and hear his version of events. That could be dangerous. It could also be necessary. Antoine stood and paced, so like Guillaume in his movements. Mother, I'm not angry that you kept this secret. I understand why you did. But I am angry about what was done to you and to Guillaume, about the coercion and cruelty. And I need to understand my own origins fully before I can decide how to rule with real justice. 2 weeks later, Antoine traveled to Brittany with a small guard, officially on a tour of the provinces. He found Guillaume's estate outside a village, a modest property with a workshop where the former executioner spent his days creating metalwork and wood carvings. Guillaume was in his workshop when the king arrived, now 49 years old, gray in his beard but still massive and strong. He stared at Antoine in shock, clearly recognizing immediately why the king had come. Your Majesty, he bowed deeply. I don't understand why you've come to my home. You know exactly why I've come. Antoine's voice was gentle but firm. Because my mother finally told me the truth about who you are to me. Guillaume's face went pale. Your Majesty, please, I never sought this, never wanted to complicate your rule. I've kept silent for 19 years. I intend to keep silent until death. I know, that's why I came, not to threaten you or demand anything, but to meet you properly, to understand where I truly came from. They talked for hours in that workshop. Guillaume told his version of events, the command he couldn't refuse, the terror of hurting the queen, the agony of watching his son grow up as another man's child. He spoke about the moral weight of his executioner role, how every life he'd taken haunted him, how being commanded to create life had been almost more difficult because it required violation instead of clean death. Antoine listened and asked questions and slowly built a relationship with the man who'd fathered him. Over the next 2 years, the king made several more trips to Brittany, always officially on royal business but always making time to visit Guillaume. They developed a cautious friendship, father and son who could never acknowledge their relationship publicly but who found connection in private. Guillaume taught Antoine advanced metalwork, shared his philosophical reflections, provided a different perspective from the court advisors and nobles. In return, Antoine gave Guillaume something he'd never expected, a relationship with his son, limited and secret but real. In 1672, disaster struck. A court noble named Philippe Chevalier, cousin to the late Philippe who'd sought succession decades earlier, began investigating Antoine's birth. He'd noticed the resemblance between the king and the former executioner, had heard whispers, had done research into the suspicious timing of Guillaume's retirement. Chevalier compiled evidence, testimony from servants who'd seen me taken to the tower room, records of Guillaume's presence at the palace that specific night, the generous pension that seemed disproportionate. He prepared to present his findings to court, to challenge Antoine's legitimacy and potentially claim the throne for himself as the nearest Bourbon relative if the king could be proven illegitimate. Antoine learned of the investigation from his spies. He called me to his private chambers along with Cardinal Mazarin's successor, and we discussed options. We could have Chevalier arrested, I said. Charge him with treason for questioning the king's legitimacy. That makes us look guilty, Antoine replied. Like we're suppressing truth. We could discredit him, make him seem mad or politically motivated. Also suspicious, the cardinal noted. The evidence he has is apparently quite compelling. So what do we do? Antoine asked. The truth is going to come out regardless of how we try to suppress it. Once Chevalier presents his findings, nobles will start questioning everything. I might face deposition, civil war, execution. Unless, he paused, thinking, unless I tell the truth first, control the narrative myself. You can't, I said immediately. It would destroy your legitimacy, would it? Or would honesty about impossible circumstances actually strengthen my position? Antoine stood and paced. Here's what I'm thinking. I call a full assembly of nobles and clergy. I present the truth myself before Chevalier can. I explain my father Louis' sterility, the political desperation, the command that forced both the Queen and Guillaume into an impossible situation. I acknowledge Guillaume as my biological father, while maintaining that legally I'm Louis's son and legitimate heir. And I dare anyone to challenge that a king who rules well should be deposed because of circumstances beyond his control at conception. It's incredibly risky, the cardinal said, but it might work, I admitted slowly. You've ruled well for 6 years. You've secured France's position, reformed the justice system, strengthened the economy. If you present this as a story of duty and necessity rather than scandal, if you emphasize that everyone involved was following royal command, you might survive the revelation. And if I don't survive, then at least I was honest. At least I controlled my own narrative rather than letting enemies use truth as a weapon. At least Guillaume's sacrifice gets acknowledged instead of remaining buried forever. Antoine made his decision. 2 weeks later, before Chevalier could present his findings, the king called an extraordinary assembly at Versailles. Every major noble, all senior clergy, key ministers and advisors gathered in the Hall of Mirrors wondering what announcement was coming. Antoine stood before them, 19 years old, strong and confident, and told them everything. My father, King Louis XII, was sterile due to a childhood illness. This was a closely guarded secret, known only to his closest advisors. By 1650, France faced succession crisis, and desperate measures were required. On his command, my mother, Queen Isabel, was instructed to conceive a child with Guillaume Marchand, the royal executioner, under threat of execution if she refused. That child is me. I am legally Louis's son, acknowledged and crowned. But biologically, I am the son of Guillaume Marchand, a man of honor, who fulfilled an impossible duty and then maintained silence for 2 decades to protect France's stability. The assembly erupted. Nobles shouted questions, accusations, demands. Clergy argued about legitimacy and divine right. The chaos lasted an hour before Antoine raised his hand for silence. I understand your shock and anger. I understand you feel deceived. But consider this. I have ruled justly for 6 years. I have strengthened France, reformed our laws, protected our people. I am the king you have followed and respected. Does the circumstance of my conception change my ability to rule? Does it matter that I carry the blood of a courageous executioner rather than a sterile king if the result is good governance? Louis acknowledged me as his son. I was crowned according to all laws and traditions. I am your legitimate king regardless of biology. And I dare any of you to argue that I should be deposed for matters entirely beyond my control. Philippe Chevalier stood. Your Majesty, with respect, the succession laws are clear. Legitimacy requires that I was acknowledged by the sitting king, which I was. It requires I was properly crowned, which I was. It requires I rule according to law and tradition, which I have. Show me which legal requirement I've failed to meet. Well, you're not King Louis's biological son. Neither was Louis his father's biological son. Antoine replied calmly. My grandfather, King Charles, was known to be sterile as well. His wife conceived my father Louis with a court musician. This has been an open secret in royal circles for decades, though carefully unspoken. So if you want to argue that non-biological succession invalidates kingship, you'll need to go back at least 2 generations to find a truly biological heir, and by that point you'll have thrown France into complete chaos. The assembly fell silent. Antoine's revelation about his grandfather's sterility, apparently true based on the shocked reactions from older nobles who'd suspected but never confirmed it, had reframed everything. The Bourbon succession had been biological fiction for at least 50 years. Revealing it now just made explicit what had been implicit. Antoine continued, I'm not claiming my situation is ideal. I'm claiming it's real, and that honesty about difficult truths is better than maintaining lies. Yes, I'm the biological son of an executioner. I'm also the legal son of a king, raised and educated to rule, proven capable through 6 years of successful governance. France is stable and prosperous. You can accept this reality and continue, or you can throw the kingdom into civil war over circumstances that can't be changed. The choice is yours. The assembly debated for 3 days. Ultimately, pragmatism won. Antoine had ruled well. The alternative to accepting him was civil war with no clear heir, and the revelation that the Bourbon line had involved unconventional conception for decades made the current situation seem less unprecedented. The church reluctantly agreed that legal acknowledgement by the sitting king constituted sufficient legitimacy regardless of biology. The nobles, seeing no better option, reaffirmed their loyalty. Antoine the Just remained king, but now as Antoine the Honest, the monarch who dared tell truth about his own origins and survived the revelation. In the aftermath, Antoine invited Guillaume to court officially, no longer as the executioner, but as the king's biological father, acknowledged and honored. Guillaume came reluctantly, uncomfortable with court life but willing to accept his son's invitation. At a formal ceremony, Antoine publicly thanked Guillaume for his sacrifice and loyal silence, granted him a higher title and more land, and ensured he would live the rest of his life in comfort and respect. "Father," Antoine said publicly, using the word deliberately, "you did what duty required under impossible circumstances. You protected France through your silence, and your son through your discretion. You deserve recognition, not shame." Guillaume, clearly overwhelmed, managed to reply, "Your Majesty, you honor me beyond anything I deserve. I just did what I had to do to survive." "As we all did," Antoine replied, "and from survival came something valuable. A king who understands justice from multiple perspectives, who knows both privilege and pain, who carries the blood of both nobility and common people. I'm a better ruler because of you, and France is better because you were brave enough to be gentle when you could have been cruel." That evening I found Guillaume in the palace gardens staring at the stars. He looked tired but peaceful. "You did well today," I told him, accepting Antoine's recognition. "It's strange," he said quietly. 22 years ago I was locked in a tower room with you, terrified I would hurt you, certain I was damned for what I was being forced to do. Now I'm standing in the palace gardens as the acknowledged father of the King of France. Life is incomprehensible. "But you survived," I pointed out. "We all survived. And from that terrible night came something good. A king who rules with both strength and compassion, who understands that justice requires mercy. That's your legacy, Guillaume. Not the executions you performed, but the son you fathered and the king he became. Do you ever regret it?" "All of it?" "The complicated truth is no," he replied. "I regret the coercion, the violation of your will, the impossible position we were both forced into. I regret every moment of fear and pain. But I don't regret Antoine. I don't regret that from darkness came light, that from duty came love of a kind, that from the worst night of both our lives came a person we're both proud of. So I carry the regret for the process while being grateful for the result, and I live with that contradiction." "So do I admitted. "I hated that night in the tower. Hated being used, being forced, being violated even though you were as gentle as possible. But I love my son, and I don't hate you, Guillaume. I never have. You were kind when you could have been cruel, and that kindness saved me in ways you probably don't understand. We stood together in the garden, two people who'd survived an impossible situation and had somehow created something valuable from trauma. Not a love story in any traditional sense, but a story of survival and unexpected grace, of doing what was necessary and finding humanity in the midst of coercion. Guillaume lived at court for the next 15 years, acknowledged as the king's biological father, advising Antoine on matters of justice and mercy. He died peacefully in 1687 at age 66, surrounded by his son and grandchildren. Antoine had married and produced heirs, continuing the complicated bloodline that now mixed Bourbon, de Valois, and Marchand heritage. At Guillaume's funeral, Antoine spoke publicly about his father's life, the executioner who'd been forced into creating life instead of taking it, who'd maintained silence to protect his son, who'd exemplified duty and sacrifice. "It's fitting," Antoine said, "that my father's legacy is justice tempered with mercy. He knew the cost of taking life, so he valued life more deeply than those who've never had to end it. He understood guilt and redemption, sin and grace, duty and love. From him I learned that strength must be balanced with compassion, that power requires restraint, that being able to hurt others means you must choose never to hurt unnecessarily. I tried to live by those principles, and I hope France is better for it." They buried Guillaume with full honors, not as an executioner but as the father of a king. His tombstone read, Guillaume Marchand, 1621 to 1687, father of Antoine the Just, who taught that mercy is the highest form of strength. I died 3 years after Guillaume in 1690 at age 59. My last thoughts were of that night in the tower room 22 years earlier. How terrified I'd been, how impossible the situation had seemed, how I'd expected brutality and found unexpected gentleness, how I'd feared death and instead created life, how from coercion and darkness had somehow come light. They buried me in the royal crypt at Saint Denis, beside King Louis, honoring the legal marriage that had defined my public life. But at Antoine's instruction, they placed a second memorial in the gardens where Guillaume and I had stood that evening. A simple stone that read, Queen Isabel 1690, who faced impossible choices with courage and created a king from darkness. Antoine ruled until 1705, dying at age 54 after a reign considered one of France's most just and prosperous. His reforms to the justice system, his emphasis on mercy, his insistence that rulers must serve their people rather than simply command them, all of it traced back to his unique heritage, the combination of royal education and executioner's understanding of life's fragility. His son Louis succeeded him, continuing the bloodline that now carried 3 different family legacies, and France prospered under the strange dynasty that had begun with coercion in a tower room. The historical records of this period are complicated and often contradictory. King Louis XII's reign from 1633 to 1654 is well documented, though medical records of his personal health remain suspiciously absent from most archives. Queen Isabel de Valois' marriage in 1648 and the birth of Prince Antoine in 1651 are recorded in official chronicles, with no contemporary questioning of the child's legitimacy despite later revelations. Guillaume Marchand appears in palace employment records as royal executioner from 1645 to 1654, with documentation of his unusually generous retirement pension. The reasons for such generosity were not officially recorded until King Antoine's 1672 Assembly revelation. Antoine the Just's reign from 1654 to 1705 is extensively documented, including the extraordinary assembly where he publicly acknowledged his biological father and the subsequent acceptance of this revelation by nobility and clergy. Contemporary accounts frequently mention the king's unusual combination of physical strength and philosophical depth, attributes that made more sense after the revelation of his executioner heritage. The relationship between Antoine and Guillaume after 1672 is documented in court records and personal letters preserved in the French National Archives. These letters, made public in 1890, reveal a genuine affection between father and son that developed despite the traumatic circumstances of conception. In 1923, historian Marie-Louise Beaumont published The Secret King, examining evidence that the Bourbon succession had involved multiple instances of concealed sterility and unconventional conception spanning 3 generations. The book created significant academic debate but was ultimately accepted as credible based on primary sources, medical analysis of royal remains, and the detailed correspondence preserved by Antoine's descendants. The story has since been studied as an example of how dynastic necessity, royal sterility, and coerced reproduction shaped European monarchies, and how individuals navigated impossible moral situations while trying to maintain humanity. Guillaume Marchand's tomb in the royal cemetery at Saint-Denis was moved in 1790 during the French Revolution and later restored, with his original epitaph preserved. Queen Isabel's garden memorial, destroyed during the Revolution, was rebuilt in 1850 and remains a site visited by those interested in the complex history of the French monarchy. Antoine's personal writings, discovered in 1967, provided additional confirmation of the circumstances of his birth and his complicated relationship with both his legal and biological fathers. The letters reveal a man of deep moral reflection who struggled with the circumstances of his conception, but ultimately concluded that honest acknowledgement of difficult truths was preferable to maintaining comfortable lies. This is the story of Isabelle de Valois and Guillaume Marchand, whose coerced encounter in a tower room created a king, and whose survival of impossible circumstances demonstrates that humanity can persist even in the darkest situations. Isabelle faced execution unless she conceived with a man she feared. Guillaume was commanded to violate everything he believed about consent and dignity. But together they created Antoine the Just, a king who ruled with wisdom precisely because he understood both privilege and pain, both power and vulnerability. If this story moves you, If you believe that people forced into impossible moral situations deserve recognition for their courage rather than condemnation for their compliance, if you believe that honesty about difficult truths matters more than maintaining comfortable fictions, subscribe now to discover more hidden histories that challenge our assumptions about power, consent, and survival. Leave a comment sharing what aspect of this story resonates most with you. Was it Isabelle's courage under threat of death, Guillaume's unexpected gentleness despite his brutal profession, or Antoine's decision to reveal the truth about his origins? Your engagement helps preserve these complex human stories that force us to confront uncomfortable questions about duty, coercion, and the strange ways that darkness can sometimes produce light. Hit subscribe, share your thoughts, and join us in exploring the complicated truths behind royal dynasties and the real people who survived impossible choices to create history.